Then the king summoned all the leaders of Yehuda and Jerusalem, and they assembled with him. The king went up to the house of Adonai with all the men of Yehuda, all those living in Jerusalem, the Kohanim, the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing everything written in the scroll of the covenant that had been found in the house of Adonai. The king stood on the platform and made a covenant in the presence of Adonai to live following Adonai, observing his mitzvot, instructions, and regulations wholeheartedly and with all his being, so as to conform the words of the covenant written in this scroll. All the people stood, pledging themselves to keep the covenant. Then the king ordered Helikehu, the Kohen Hagadol, the Kohanim, on the second rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the sanctuary of Adonai all the articles that had been made for Baal, for the Asherah, and for the entire army of heaven. And he burned them up outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Beit El. He deposed the idolatrous priests the kings of Yehuda had ordained to offer on the high places by the cities of Yehuda and the places surrounding Jerusalem. He also deposed those who offered to Baal, the sun, the moon, the constellations, and the whole army of heaven. He took the Asherah from the house of Adonai to Vadi Kidron outside Jerusalem and burned it in the Vadi Kidron, stamped the ashes to powder, and threw the powder onto the burial ground for the common people. He smashed the houses of the cult prostitutes that were in the house of Adonai, where the women also wove garments for the Asherah. He removed the Kohanim from the cities of Yehuda, then from Giva to Beersheba. He desecrated the high places where the Kohanim had been making offerings. He also smashed the high places of the gates that were in the entrance of the gate of Yehoshua, the governor of the city, on the left, as one enters the city. But although the Kohanim who had been at the high places did not come up to the altar of Adonai in Jerusalem, nevertheless, they did share matzah with their kinsmen. He desecrated the Tophet fire pit in Ben Hinnom Valley, so that no one could cause his son or daughter to pass through the fire as a sacrifice to Molech. He confiscated the horses which the kings of Yehuda had given to the sun at the entrance of the house of Adonai, near the room of the officer Natan Melech, in the side courtyard, and he burned up the chariots of the sun. The king smashed the altars on the roof in the upper room of Achaz, which the kings of Yehuda had made, and the altar which Manasseh had made into the two courtyards of the house of Adonai. He broke them into pieces and threw the rubble into the Vadi Kidron. The king desecrated the high places facing Jerusalem south of the Mount Destruction, which Shlomo, the king of Israel, had built for Ashtaroth, the abomination of Zidonim, Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Milcom, the abomination of the people of Ammon. He smashed the standing stones, chopped down the sacred poles, and covered their remains with human bones. He smashed the altar that was at Beit El and the high places made by Jeroboam, the son of Nevat, who caused Israel to sin. Yes, he smashed that altar in the high places. He burned the high places and stamped the ashes to powder and burned up the Asherah. Then as Yehoshiahu was turning around, he noticed the burial caves that were there on the mountain. So he sent and had the bones taken out of the burial caves and burned them on the altar, thus desecrating it, in keeping with the word of Adonai which the man of God had proclaimed, foretelling that these things would happen. Then he asked, "This mountain here that I'm looking at, what is it?" The men of the city told him, "It marks the burial cave of the man of God who came from Yehuda and foretold the very things you have done to the altar of Beit El." He replied, "Let him be. No one is to move his bones." So they left his bones undisturbed, along with the bones of the prophets who had come from Shomron. Yeshayahu also removed the all the shrines of the high places in the cities of Shamron, which the kings of Israel had made in order to provoke Adonai to anger, and treated them the same as Beit El. He put to death all the priests in those high places and the altars there. They burned human bones on them. Finally, he returned to Jerusalem. The king issued this order to all the people: observe Pesach to Adonai your God, as written in the scroll of the covenant. For Pesach had not been so observed since the days when the judges ruled Israel, not during the times of any of the kings of Israel or of the kings of Yehuda, but in the 18th year, king of Yeshayahu, this Pesach was observed to Adonai in Jerusalem. Yeshayahu got rid of the mediums and the people using spirit guides, as well as the household gods, the idols, and all the disgusting things spotted anywhere in Yehuda and Jerusalem. He did this in order to establish the words of the Torah written in the scroll of Hilkiah, the Kohen, had found in the house of Adonai. No previous king was like him, because he turned to Adonai with all his heart, with all his being, and with all his power, in accordance with all the Torah of Moshe, nor did any king like him arise afterwards. Nevertheless, Adonai did not turn away from his fiercely raging, furious anger that burned against Yehuda because of all the things Manasseh had done to provoke him. Adonai said, "Just as I have removed Israel, I will also remove Yehuda out of my sight. I will reject this city which I chose, Jerusalem, and the house concerning which I said, my name will be there." Other activities of Yeshayahu and all his accomplishments are recorded in the annals of the kings of Yehuda. During his time, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up toward the Euphrates River to attack the king of Ashur. King Yeshayahu went out opposite him, but at Megiddo, Pharaoh spotted Yeshayahu and killed him. His servants carried his dead body from Megiddo to Jerusalem in a chariot and buried him in his own tomb. The people of the land took Yochaz, son of Yeshayahu, anointed him, and made him king in his father's place. Yochaz was 23 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah from Libnah. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything his ancestors had done. Pharaoh Necho imprisoned him at Ravlah in the land of Hamath, so that he would not be able to rule in Jerusalem. He also imposed a penalty on the land, 3¼ tons of silver and 60 pounds of gold. Then Pharaoh Necho had made Eliakim, the son of Yeshayahu, king in place of Yeshayahu, his father, and changed his name to Yoakim. He also carried Yochaz off to Egypt, where he died. Yoakim remitted the silver and gold to Pharaoh, but in order to pay the money Pharaoh demanded, he had levied a tax on hand. He taxed the people of the land, each according to his means, to pay the silver and gold to Pharaoh Necho. Yoakim was 25 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zudah, the daughter of Pedaiah from Ramah. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything his ancestors had done. It was in Joachim's time that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, invaded. Joachim became his vessel for 3 years. But then he turned against him and rebelled. Adonai sent against him raiding parties from Kesdim, Aram, Moab, and the people of Ammon. He sent them against Yehuda to destroy it, in keeping with the word of Adonai, which he spoke through the servants, the prophets. Yes, it was at Adonai's order that this happened to Yehuda, in order to remove them from his sight, because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, and also because of the innocent blood which was shed. For he had flooded Jerusalem with innocent blood, and Adonai was unwilling to forgive. Other activities of Joachim and all his accomplishments are recorded in the annals of the kings of Yehuda. Then Joachim slept with his ancestors, and Joachim, his son, took his place as king. The king of Egypt did did not leave his own land anymore because the king of Babel had captured all the territory of the king of Egypt between the Valley of Egypt and the Euphrates River. Joachim was 18 years old when he began his reign, and he ruled in Jerusalem for 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan from Jerusalem. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything his father had done. It was then that the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, marched on Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, himself went to the city while it was under siege, and Joachim, king of Yehuda, went out to meet the king of Babel. He and his mother, his servants, princes and officers, and the king of Babel took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He also carried away from there all the treasures of the house of Adonai and the treasures of the royal palace. He cut in pieces the articles of the gold which Shlomo, king of Israel, had made in the temple of Adonai, as Adonai had said would happen. He carried all Jerusalem away captive, all the princes, all the brave soldiers, 10,000 captives, also all the craftsmen and metalworkers. No one was left but the poorest people of the land. Joachim he carried off to Babel. Likewise, he carried off the king's mother, the king's wives, his officers and main leaders of the land of Jerusalem into captivity in Babel. All the strongest men, 7,000 of them, as well as 1,000 craftsmen and metalworkers, all of them strong and trained for war, the king of Babel brought captive to Babel. The king of Babel made Mattanah, Joachim's father's brother, king of the place of Joachim's, changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began his rule. He ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Yirmiyahu from Livna. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything Joachim had done. And it was because Adonai's anger that all these things happened to Jerusalem and Yehuda until he had thrown them out of his presence. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babel. So in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, marched against Jerusalem with his entire army. He set up camp against it and built siege towers against it on every side. The city remained under siege into the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the month, 4th month, when the famine of the city was so severe that there was no food for the people in the land, they broke through into the city. All the soldiers fled by night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden because the Kisdim were surrounding the city. The king took the route through the Arava, but the army of the Kisdim went in pursuit of the king and overtook him in the plains near Jericho. All his troops deserted him. Then they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babel in Revlah, where they passed judgment on him. They slaughtered his sons before his eyes. Then they put out Zedekiah's eyes, bound him in chains, and carried him off to Babel. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was also the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, Nebzaradan, the commander of the guard and the officer of the king of Babel, entered Jerusalem. He burned down the house of Adonai, the royal palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every notable person's house he burned to the ground. The whole army of the Kestim, who were with the commanders of the guard, broke down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the guard, then deported the remaining population of the city, the deserters who had defected the king of Babel, and the rest of the common people. But the commanders of the guard left behind them some of the poor people of the land to be vineyard workers and farmers. The Kestim smashed the bronze columns of the house of Adonai, also the trolleys of the bronze sea, and were in the house of Adonai, and carried their bronze to Babel. They also took away the pots, shovels, snuffers, pans, and all the bronze articles that had been used for worship. The commander of the guard took the censers, the sprinkling bowls, everything made of gold and silver, the bronze and the 2 columns and the seas and the bases, which Shlomo had made for the house of Adonai, was more that could be weighed. The height of the one column was 31.5 feet. It was the capital of the bronze 5.25 feet high, with netting pomegranates all around the capital, all the bronze. The second column was similar, also with the netting. The commander of the guard took prisoner Sirah, the chief Kohen, Ziriah, the second-ranking Kohen, and the 3 doorkeepers. From the city he took an official, the chief of the soldiers, 5 close associates of the king who had been found in the city, the army commander's secretary, the change in military conscription, and 60 of the common people found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander of guard, took them and brought them to the king of Baval in Ravlah. There in Ravlah, in the land of Hamath, the king of Baval had put them to death. Thus, Yehuda was carried away captive out of his land. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Baval, appointed Gedaliah, the king of Acham, the son of Shaphan, governor over the people remaining behind the land of Yehuda after he had left. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Baval had made Gedaliah governor, they came to Gedaliah in Mitzpah. Yishmael, the son of Nethaniah, Yechanan, the son of Kirach, Syria, the son of Tankumet, the Nephati, and Yesiyahu, the son of Mechayeti. They are their men. Taking an oath, Gedaliah said to them, "Don't be afraid of the servants of the Casdim. Just live in the land and serve the king of Baval, and the things will go well for you." But in the 7th month, Yishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, the royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gilead, and of the Judeans and the Casdim who were with him in Mitzpah. In the wake of this, all kinds of people, great and small, as well as the army officers, set out and went to Egypt, because they were afraid of the Casdim. In the 37th year of the captivity of Joachim, king of Yehuda, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evel Mordech began his reign as king of Bavel. And in this first year he committed the sentence of Joachim, king of Yehuda, and released him from prison. He treated him with kindness and gave him a throne higher than those of other kings who were with him in Bavel. So Joachim no longer had to wear prison clothes. Moreover, he was provided food as long as he lived, and he was granted a daily allowance by the king to spend on his other needs for as long as he lived.